I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and I extend our respects to any First Nations who might be joining us here. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And as the acknowledgement of country should be kind of a weighty affair, I'd like to just say a few things about IPCS and the IPCS project in relation to that. So I'd like to say that the Institute as a project, as a gathering community, which is what we are, of migrant, diasporic, people seeking refuge, inheriting and questioning settler histories of people who are differently racialized, as a community that comes together to make a particular kind of intervention through its work, stands in solidarity with First Nations struggles for social justice and decolonization here in Nam, across the continent of what we now know as Australia, and overseas in Palestine, in Western Sahara, and in other political elsewheres. So once again, welcome. So I'll just say a few more things about IPCS, and then I'll pass the microphone on to our good friend Tasnim Sammak, who'll be chairing tonight's chat. So the Institute of Postcolonial Studies is, as many of you know, an independent public education project. We're an autonomous project, right? So this autonomy means that we're not affiliated or linked to any university, and this means that we can do particular kinds of work, but it also presents some challenges, right? In particular, financial challenges. So this is where I do a little plug for membership, right? And membership is a key way of sustaining the project. It's a way in which you show substantially the importance of what we're trying to do here. So join us if you're not yet a member. There are other ways in which you could support. If you'd like to have a chat about that, please approach me maybe after the event or come another day and we can have a conversation about that as well. So IPCS interrogates colonial relations, right? And we do that through public-facing events of this kind, by working with scholar activists and academics and researchers, but we also do it, of course, through that journal that some of you might know, Postcolonial Studies. But we also do it by through the kind of work that happens maybe in closed doors, and through our reading group and other kinds of spaces that we've created over the last couple of years. So IPCS, in that sense, is different kinds of relations that come to support the interrogation of colonial relations here in Nam. This week has been a week of Palestine for us. Some of you may have joined us on Wednesday when we had Sari Makdizi and Jordi Silvenstein. Some of you, a couple of people here were in the workshop we had earlier in the day and with Ramzy Baroud. But Palestine, which is here with us now, which we're looking at focusing on now, is in a way always present here at IPCS, right? We have active members who are key to the project, who keep the Palestine discussion and solidarity present week after week. So real pleased to be doing this tonight. I'd also like to thank our friends over at APAN, the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network, Free Palestine Melbourne. All these organizations are friends of IPCS with whom we're collaborating to hold this and what we've been doing throughout the week. In particular, I'd like to thank Tasnim Sammak, Michaela Sahar, Noura Mansour, and others associated with these organizations. I'd also like to thank the IPCS working group, who are kind of helping out and supporting what we're doing here right now. That's John Henry Porter here on tech, Sheherisan Blue on sound, and a few others have been helping as well. And of course, it's a pleasure to have here with us Ramzy Baroud, Evelyn Araluen, Tasnim Sammak, and Jeanine Leane, who's joining us via Zoom. Actually, a quick little check here. Jeanine, I hope you can hear us well. Let's see whether we can hear you as well.
Yes, thank you. I can hear you well.
Perfect, perfect. Let me then now introduce Tasnim, who, as I mentioned, is a friend of IPCS, an active member of the Institute. Tasnim is a PhD candidate at Monash University, in the Faculty of Education, and she's a Palestinian organizer. Her research project explores the emergence of radical political subjectivities and imaginaries, in particular looking at the becoming political of the 9/11 Muslim generation. Tasnim's grandparents were exiled from Jaffa during the Nakba in 1948 to a refugee camp in Gaza, where they, including her father, were again displaced to Al Hussein refugee camp in Amman after the annexations of 1967, when her mother and her family were also exiled from Yabad, Jenin in the West Bank. Thank you, everyone, and please make everyone welcome.
Is this working? Yep. Thank you everyone for being here and for supporting this series that we're holding at IPCS in honor of various guests who have come to this continent, to so-called Australia, as part of Adelaide Writers Festival. On Wednesday, we had Sari, and today we have the honor of speaking with Ramzy Baroud. So I'll just do introductions and then we can have that discussion between our guests today, Jeanine, Evelyn, and Ramzy. So Ramzy Baroud, who you all know, is a syndicated columnist, the author of 6 books and the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. Baroud has a PhD in Palestine studies. His books include My Father Was a Freedom Fighter and The Last Earth. His latest book, co-edited with Professor Ayaan Pape, is Our Vision for Liberation: Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. Baroud is currently a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs in Istanbul, Turkey. And we also have with us on Zoom, Jeanine Leane, who's a Wurundjeri writer, poet, and academic from Southwest New South Wales. Her poetry, short stories, critique, and essays have been published in Hecate, an interdisciplinary journal of women's liberation, Australian Poetry Journal, Antipodes, Overland, and the Sydney Review of Books. Jeanine has published widely in the area of Aboriginal literature, writing, otherness, and creative nonfiction. Jeanine also teaches creative writing and Aboriginal literature at the University of Melbourne. She is the recipient of the Australian Research Council Fellowship for a project called Aboriginal Writing, Shaping the Literary and Cultural History of Australia since 1988, and a second ARC grant that looks at Indigenous storytelling and the archive. Evelyn, next to me, is a poet, educator, and co-editor of Overland. Her stellar prize-winning book, Drop Bear, was published by UQP in 2021. Her published criticism, fiction, and poetry has been awarded the Nakata Brophy Prize for Young Indigenous Writers, the Judith Wright Poetry Prize, a Wheeler Centre Next Chapter Fellowship, and a Neilma Sydney Literary Travel Fund grant. Born and raised on Durag country, she is a descendant of the Bundjalung Nation. Is that right? Yeah. And I wanted to also do an acknowledgement that we are on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, including elders that are here with us today, and to also... Oh, sure. Yep. Jeanine, was there something you wanted to add? Oh.
Oh, I did want to just say, but I can say it when I introduce myself, Wiradjuri writer. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wanted to acknowledge Indigenous peoples from various Global South contexts who are here with us today as well, and that it's always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So over to you, Ramzy, with some... So the format of today is we'll have each of our speakers give some opening remarks on the theme of tonight, which is on courageous writing, and have a conversation across the various writing projects and programs that we're involved in. And then we'll have a conversation with the audience here on Zoom.
Thank you very much, Tasnim, and thanks to all of you for being here and for all the support that we are receiving from you yesterday, today, and always. I have the habit of accepting the themes of any talk that I'm asked to participate in, but kind of later kind of challenging that theme in public. And at the Adelaide Festival, there was the question of taking sides. That was the theme of my talk, writers taking sides. And I challenged that by saying, for us Palestinians, and any writer coming from an oppressed background, there is no taking sides. You know, for you, ideas, writings, and intellects is a matter of survival. It's not a philosophical subject. It's not a discussion over the writings of Nietzsche or any other conceptual philosophy. It's the everyday reality. And I would challenge this theme as well and say, no, we are not involved in the courageous writing business. We are involved in truth-telling. And I think that's why the Zionists are going crazy trying to prevent us from representing ourselves, because the whole idea of me denying you a voice is I am aware of the fact that your voice is going to be linked to some kind of a power paradigm. If you are absent from the discussion, your rights have no meaning and they are not part of the discussion in the first place. And that's why the Zionists are scared. They're not really truly scared that we are anti-Semites and we are promoting hate speech and that sort of thing. If that was the case, then bring us and expose us for the hate speech that we are promoting. To the contrary, that's your opportunity to really, tell your audiences, see, these are the hate mongers we've been talking about. But the idea is, it goes beyond that. They want us to be completely removed from the conversation. If we look at, and feel free to stop me at any point, Tasnim, I have the habit of just going like a, thank you, you're very kind. Within the Palestinian discourse, for many, many years, Palestinians have been taken away from the discussion regarding Palestine. And by the way, this is not just a mainstream media discussion. Even within Arab political spaces, for many, many years, Palestinians were told, this is an issue that's bigger than you. It's an Arab issue, or it's a Muslim issue. That it doesn't mean that there is no components of these struggles within the Palestinian struggle, but it's also about dominance. It's about marginalizing the Palestinian in his own discussion, in his own discourse, and ultimately in his own struggle. But, generation after generation of Palestinians, from early Palestinian intellectuals, the likes of Walid Khalidi, Ghassan Kanafani, Fadwa Tuqan, Palestinians have refused to play the role of the supporting actors, or the people politely sitting in the audience and just nodding their heads. It's our struggle, it's our story, and we are going to fight for it. I was talking to a colleague here, Shireen Salama, earlier today, and we were talking about Shireen Abu Akleh. That's a Palestinian who for many years have insisted but to be this, the conveyor of the Palestinian voice. Palestinians do have a voice. Quite often we are shut out of the conversation. And sometimes the people who are trying to help convey that voice become the enemy. And that's why Shireen Abu Akleh was killed. She wasn't killed because the soldier didn't see her. She was killed because she was playing a critical role in allowing the Palestinian voice to reach the rest of the world. One of the struggles we've had with Oslo, the Oslo Peace Accords, is not just the fact that Oslo was an unfair agreement and it was a non-starter as far as peace and justice is concerned. That has been analyzed to death, and many people now agree that we were right all along, that Oslo was a disaster from a political point of view. But what we rarely discuss is Oslo in terms of discourse, in terms of language, in terms of culture, right? Because we were told all these years ago that the polite Palestinians, or the Palestinians we are willing to do business with, is the Palestinian who refrain from using certain language. That the language that would qualify you as a terrorist sympathizer or as a radical or even as a terrorist yourself. our great intellectuals like Edward Said, a Christian himself, was accused of being an Islamic radical and a terrorist sympathizer, and the man is not even a Muslim. But it doesn't matter. It's not about religion. It's not about race. It's not about geography. It's about something else entirely. It's about the limitations imposed on the discourse. And indeed, Mahmoud Abbas and his ilk survived in power despite the fact that they no longer really serve a functional role in terms of politics. We can debate that. We can argue if Mahmoud Abbas continued to serve a role or not. But his most important role is he is the one who is taming the language of the Palestinian discourse. And he is used to juxtapose that good moderate Palestinian versus the radical crazies, leftist, nut job, Islamic, this and that, the likes of myself and others. So it is really about language. Ultimately, it is about language. And if we succeed in truly recreating that language, we will succeed, I think, in starting the political discourse on the right track. For example, when Jimmy Carter came up with wrote his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, at the time, he was immediately called anti-Semite, and so many organizations, some of the most well-respected international human rights organizations of today, wouldn't even acknowledge or wouldn't agree with the concept that there is an apartheid. We've known that there's been an apartheid in Palestine for a very long time. Apartheid is not a new process. The fact that it's a group of people that comes and uproots another group of people because of their race, religion, ethnicity, and push them out and claim their spaces entirely and rewrite the laws in such a way that ensures the dominance of one group over the other, that's apartheid. And that apartheid started in 47, 48, and even prior to that, when there was such a thing as a Zionist institution that existed prior to the existence of Israel. And they were kind of formulating that apartheid. What took Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and Beit Salem all of these years to reach that simple conclusion? You don't need to be an international law expert to realize that there was apartheid in Palestine. It's language, because there are certain language that used to be kind of a no-go. You can't use that language and remain in your academic position or in your newspaper or remain a respected politician within polite company. You can't. Because people like Carter challenged that paradigm and many others, now they are catching on and everybody is saying, well, it is apartheid after all. So ultimately it was language. So what we do in the militant journalism business and the radical journalism business, if you will, is that we introduce the language that is not considered the proper language. It's the correct language, it's the truthful language. And we hope that maybe within our lifetime, people are going to catch on and they start adopting that language. So I would say be as radical on the side of truth as humanly possible. It might be difficult now, it might be tough, you might find yourself isolated and alone, but at the end of the day, believe me, they will catch on, and the language, the radical language of today will become the mainstream language of tomorrow.
Thank you, Ramzy. And we definitely want to hear more about this militant journalism approach to writing, if we won't call it courageous writing. I like militant, it's better. We'll go to Jeanine Leane now to give us her contribution and speak about this, speaking to the mainstream, not speaking to the mainstream, those, complexities in terms of who we address and how we speak.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, Yuradu Marang, everyone. Joining you today and acknowledging Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples in Canberra, where I have lived for quite a long time and where I like to go when I'm not living in Naarm. And also like to acknowledge having the privilege of living and working in Naarm on the lands of the Kulin Nations. I belong to the Wiradjuri people of the Murrumbidgee River on on the Nangus Plains near Gundagai. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all other First Nations peoples who are here today, and in solidarity with all people on invaded and occupied lands. And I'd also just like to extend thanks to Michaela and Tasnim for organising today. Yeah, look, I had the privilege of speaking at the Adelaide Writers' Week with quite a few writers, and also speaking with Ramzy. And I also, in particular, had the great pleasure of speaking with Muhammad Al-Kurd, but also spoke to Ramzy, spoke to Susan Adel-Hawi. Sorry if I have pronounced that not well. And have had the pleasure of working with Michaela for quite a while. So what I would like to say, and what I talked about in Adelaide, Tandanya, Adelaide, was like about writing, incarceration, entrapment, I think, in the language of the nation. And so you have to write a nation, you don't have to write country. Country is stories, and country just is. And like much of the colonisation of Australia has been done through translation. And the first act, I think, of forgetting, because Australia has a terrible short memory, or terrible ongoing national amnesia. And I think as an invaded and people whose lands are always was, always will be unceded and occupied lands, is the volume of work that's been written about us, for us, that is really entrenched, as much as our actual physical and literal incarceration, which is also a national disgrace, is also that language incarceration. Speaking of, following on from Ramzy. And occupation and ongoing cultural genocide does happen through forgetting. And I think the thing I want to say too about the Australian invasion, occupation and cultural genocide was it was not, definitely not quiet or not unviolent. It was quite brutal for the people who endured it. But the way it was reported on, the language of that to the rest of the world at the time, particularly to those colonies and Britain, and was like really legally sanctioned language, and very modern language as well. This is post-Rousseau, post-John Locke. And so modern technology, I suppose, made the actual pace and the effectiveness as far as invaders were concerned, and of killing swift in a way, far too swift really. But then modern law and that English language, the rise of language that is all about private property, and the rise of language that is quite violent but is couched in very legal terms. And it was modern education that continues to help create the conditions where this official and, largely legally sanctioned and largely official, or totally official, legally sanctioned and largely silent conditions about the occupation and invasion and the cultural genocide in Australia is, you know, largely silenced. And so later on, perhaps I want to move to perhaps Evelyn, but, you know, later on I wanted to pick up and talk about truth-telling or truth writing, and the idea that people use the term safe spaces a lot, but that can become really dangerously unbalanced, because what's a safe space for me might not be, or, you know, other First Nations people might not be a safe space, or isn't, because colonists, settlers tend to be offended by the language of First Nations people, and they say it makes them unsafe. So it's more about, yeah, in some ways we talked about breaking the space. The term brave spaces was used at the festival, which, yeah, brave spaces, but brave spaces, or writing into brave spaces and breaking out of that, you know, what might be safe for colonisers to read, or what they might like to hear and what they don't want to hear when it's written from now a First Nations perspective, gets now, I think, dangerously lost in arguments about who's safe and where. Yeah, and I also wanted to talk about the dangerous white imagination, which, in keeping with Australian literary culture, Australian writing culture, like the nation itself, is actually premised on stealing and theft and appropriation. So, you know, there are people like myself, like Evelyn, like, you know, other First Nations writers, other writers who write against a white mainstream kind of discourse. But it is, takes a lot of energy and can be really risky to even try and break that space. But now, thanks. That's all I'll say for an opener.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Hello. I would also like to echo Auntie Jeanine's acknowledgements and the emphasis that she places on the unceded lands upon which we're meeting today. As a First Nations woman, it is always imperative for myself to acknowledge when I'm a guest on somebody else's country. The Kulin Nation is not my country. I have had family who have sought shelter here over, you know, various generations, but it is not my land. And as such, I just want to, as always, acknowledge the custodianship, the care for country, and the sovereignty of Wurundjeri peoples, especially in the Kulin Nation more broadly. And to just thank IPCS, to thank Tasnim, Michaela and Carlos for all of your organising. I know this is just one part of a broader week of events with a focus on Palestinian sovereignty and solidarity. And Ramzy, thank you for coming and joining these discussions. I know you must be pretty exhausted. You've been going all around the country, it seems, speaking on this, but it's important that it is spoken about in Australia. This is a settler colony. It's a settler colony that does have political, financial, global, broader international networks and affiliations with Israel. And that's something that we should all be reflective of and accountable towards, even if we are here ourselves as dispossessed or displaced peoples, as many of the people in this room tonight would be. You know, it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land, but that does not mean that we are not also accountable to a broader international network of solidarity that Australia, the settler colonial Australian colony, is implicated in. So I'm kind of here speaking not necessarily explicitly from my position as an Aboriginal woman, although that does inform the baseline of everything that I do, but more so kind of as a reflection of the organisation that I work for. So I'm an editor, co-editor in chief with Jonathan Dunk, who's somewhere in this space. That's not a metaphor, like he's somewhere in the room. Overland Literary Magazine. We are a journal that publishes political writing, fiction, poetry, essay, commentary, all of that, and visual art as well. That was first established in 1954 by some, I believe they were not at the time members of the Australian Communist Party. I think they'd actually perhaps been kicked out at that stage. Stephen Murray Smith in particular. And Overland was founded with an emphasis on democratic left-wing politics, and that's a spirit that has carried through its history. Jonathan and myself inherited this role at the very end of 2019. And so our tenure is kind of coming off of many decades of solidarity and work to platform unrepresented, marginalized, oppressed positionalities. And from what I've been able to ascertain from the archive, that has included a long-standing commitment to acknowledging the violence and ongoing oppression against Palestinians, not just in Palestine, but also in, the diasporic communities that the ongoing structure of exile has forced Palestinians into. And I can see traces of of that solidarity from at least the early 60s. So there's, I think, a long-standing commitment there that we are accountable to as editors coming into this position. So, Tasnim and I were sort of discussing a little bit earlier about what to say here and what contribution we can necessarily be making here. And suppose I wanted to place a little bit of context around the landscape of Australian media, and particularly where, this idea of progressive except for Palestine has originated. It was something that we were deeply conscious of pretty much from the first moment that we stepped into our editorial roles. We'd obviously seen it working more broadly in the community, but as writers, as creative practitioners with a consciousness of publications such as the Saturday paper and the monthly and the quarterly, all affiliated with Schwartz Media, and the kind of financial hold that Schwartz Media does have over the Australian publishing landscape through outlets such as Black Ink, 7am, and various other quite reputable and really well-established and really well-funded literary and artistic organisations and institutions. And as such, it's surprising that it has been such an extensive infiltration of the broader publishing landscape, and yet there has been such little commentary up until perhaps the last sort of year or so regarding this formal position of progressive except for Palestine. So if people haven't read it, Matt Chun, who organised the Sunday paper, which was a rebuttal to the Saturday paper, actually has a really excellent summary of the history of Schwartz Media and Maurice Schwartz in particular, who had made active attempts to join the Zionist military and wanted to actively participate in massacre, in genocide. And that's a very well documented commitment on his part. He said, there's a quote that I wanted to pull up. In 2017, he told The Age, Maurice Schwartz told The Age in an interview, "I have no shame in saying that I am a great supporter of Israel." And that has then translated into a broader emphasis for all outlets affiliated with Schwartz Media that essentially state that you are not allowed to mention Palestine. And if you are going to talk about Israel, you have to be, avowedly pro-Israeli violence, dispossession, displacement of Palestinians. That is the position that you have to have. That is a position that was upheld by the various editors affiliated with all of Schwartz Media's outlets. And unfortunately, I think that logic, progressive except for Palestine, has actually infiltrated a number of other organizations. So I think could be last year, but it could also have been earlier than that. My sense of time is pretty bizarre these days. But Michaela, Randa, Abdul Fattah, another writer, and I've lost the internet, organised a statement of artists and academics against annexation that was actually originally, and many, I see nods, people are aware of this campaign. It was brought to Overland after, unfortunately, some really unsuccessful attempts to bring this to the attention of other publishing outlets that had a broader outreach than we do at Overland. So while we, of course, love supporting campaign pieces, we're totally conscious of the fact that we don't have the same kind of readership of The Guardian or The Age. And actually, we do think that when possible for campaign pieces, as brilliant as it is to have people bring them to us, if you can get that further outreach, great, go for it, do it. It's going to help the cause. The Guardian was uninterested or felt unable to actually speak on the Australian government's complicity in enabling the Israeli state to suppress Palestinian people's self-determination. And what that kind of ended up with was essentially an impasse where the names of hundreds of academics and writers and scholars who were perhaps not even working in this field, but could see, Ramzy, you've been highlighting, this is not necessarily a question of whose side you're on. This is a question of justice and injustice. They were then unable to actually even speak of the fact that that solidarity existed. This was no longer at that point a way of increasing awareness of the campaign. It was actually to provide a record, a document that these commitments exist in the community, and to even acknowledge that was something that was apparently beyond the capacity of The Guardian at that particular point in time. So the long and the short of it, we published the statement and then The Guardian picked it up. So that's a clear, very, very clear demonstration of the capacity of smaller publications such as Overland, which are still, obviously, we still do have limitations. We get hate mail, we get really nasty messages. I wish people would realise that we actually have those IP addresses, so we know when they send us a nasty message under one name and then they send us a lovely message on another issue of social justice under a different name. We actually know that this is the same person who's just being horrendously cruel about Palestine, but will be an advocate about another oppressed marginal group. That's just a fun fact for people who like to send us hate mail. So, we still have limitations, of course, but there is a really clear capacity around resourcing and around the platforming of those kinds of campaigns and statements that then place a greater pressure on larger publishing outlets who should be responsible. A big part of the emphasis of how, you were framing this discussion is about what's everyone's responsibility here. Particularly in a settler colony, that has a media landscape that is so deeply entangled in Zionism and the Zionist state. And it's something that, from the get-go, we inherited Overland's commitment. That was not something that we brought into the room. I do want to emphasize that. Michaela, worked on and also you were in the anniversary Nakba edition. This is a commitment that is long-standing with Overland, and we're really proud to be able to step into that and do our very best to extend it, even as the landscape changes, even as we get a greater kind of awareness of the limitations that other outlets might be facing and that we might also be facing. That, as Ramzy is stating, that this is something that needs to be, kind of a continuous radical action. I've been listening a lot to some of the talks you've been doing, and I think that one of the things that you've kind of been emphasizing really is that this is not something that people can be selectively in solidarity for, I think. And so doing our best to work with the resources that we have in order to position Overland to amplify people who are sadly not being amplified by the so-called progressive media outlets in our country. And we're not even talking about the Australian. We're not talking about Sky News. those are unrelated, but it's those spaces that should be there and should not be selective about their solidarity. And I think, it's on us. It's on smaller platforms to do our best to make them responsible to those communities.
Thank you, Evelyn. I wanted to go to Ramzy to kind of make some connections here between the two projects, Overland, and then we have the Palestine Chronicle that you founded and are an editor of, and you know, some of the insights you've had from establishing this project and also just working within an international but also US-based, very much Zionist landscape, as we know.
Thank you, and thanks to the other speakers for kind of creating the a kind of a conceptual framework for their work and their impressive research. I think for us Palestinians, we've been told that the only way you can win Western societies to your side is if you know how to speak their language. And as a result, we became very keenly invested in getting published in mainstream newspapers. Because for us, that was kind of it was a way of saying that if you managed to get an opinion published in the New York Times or the Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, it means that the Palestinian viewpoint is now increasingly making it to mainstream settings, and therefore it's only the matter of time before the people will side with you. But that was a trap. That was really never was intended to work anyway. It was just kind of part of the pacification of the Palestinian intellectual. Notice, for example, if you pick any Palestinian who is published in a mainstream newspaper, and then you would compare his language in that article versus his language in a more radical publication. And I'm using the word radical only in contrast, like the Electronic Intifada or the Palestine Chronicle. You will find that he or she tried their very best to serve the sensibilities of Western audiences. That also enter into the whole, discourse of the humanization of the Palestinian, as if the dehumanization carried out by Israel is our responsibility to reverse by showing that we are humans. There was a website started many years ago, doesn't exist anymore. I know that they raised a massive amount of money, and it was a photography website where it was pictures of like really famous personalities like Albert Einstein or, people like that, like the iconic pictures, yeah? And then on the other side of the screen, it will be a picture of a Palestinian child who are positioned in the photo to look like Albert Einstein. And $1.5 million went to that project, mind you, and it was pathetic and stupid, but sad in the sense that we were told this is how, like, the Western audience is going to come and say, wait a minute, Palestinians are capable of looking like Albert Einstein? Well, that changes everything, and of course it doesn't work that way. The humanization of the Palestinian sometimes becomes the very dehumanization of the Palestinian. And that's quite a dangerous phenomenon. But at the end of the day, if you are going to engage with Western media, you have to accept the fact that it's their game played by their rules. And it's not the matter of, gradual change before the shift happens. There will be no gradual change, and certainly there will be no shift. Simply because corporate media, mainstream media is corporate media. Corporate media stands for the interest of a specific company with board of directors and individuals and billionaires. And for you just to think that you can shift, the mainstream mindset by altering the dynamics of how corporate media works, whether in the case of Palestine or Burma or Ukraine or anything, you are sadly mistaken. It doesn't work that way. That shift never really happened, and a lot of time and energy was wasted of us trying to get the ABC to do an interview on this or the CNN to do that. And once we do have that tiny little allocated time, we get so excited and we completely refuse to accept the fact that in exchange for Ramzy appearing on CNN International, 1,000 journalists, 1,000 Zionists was brought to CNN to balance out what Ramzy has said. At the time, I start realizing, wait a minute, I'm actually hurting my cause. I'm not helping my cause. you see? And that's really where the idea of the Palestine Chronicle came about. We started in 1999. It was an outcome of the frustration that we are never able to be allocated a space in which we can be ourselves, right or wrong, radical or moderate. But these are the Palestinian voices, and these are Palestine's intellectuals, and that's how they think, and that's how they see the world. And with time, we managed to actually, and thanks to social media, although now we are under severe censorship, I mean, that's a whole different topic of what we actually endure in order for us to subsist in social media. We are actually able to do the kind of impact. I mean, just to give you a story, a very short example, Kenneth Roth, who used to be the head of Human Rights Watch, and he was fired from his position at Harvard because of the position that HRW took on apartheid in Israel. And no one wanted to publish anything about Kenneth Roth. It was two organizations that hosted him and started this whole thing that eventually engaged mainstream media, and he was eventually reinstated in his position at Harvard. And these are Palestine Deep Dive and the Palestine Chronicle, right? So we reach that kind of impact, not because we are such incredible journalists, but because we have a community of people and allies and other radical outlets, from Counterpunch to Common Dreams to antiwar.com to Z Magazine to so many others. We work together, and through our own social media impact, we can unleash the kind of consequences that would make a university like Harvard think twice about firing Kenneth Roth. So this is kind of how you take a small organization built from the bottom up to a position of power, but again, within a larger community, as opposed to, you know, one single article in The Guardian that is enough for us to celebrate for the next 3 years. I think this is far more effective over time. And again, our voice remains unblemished, truthful, and you know, without the filters that are imposed on us by mainstream media.
We'll go to Auntie Jeanine, and maybe return to what you discussed about the white imagination. And I guess I have a quote from one of your pieces where you talk about the margins, if you allow me to read it.
Sure.
Margins do not just encircle the center and sit passively outside its edges of exclusion and misrepresentation. We moved into its space, not to be like it or to speak for it, but to speak to it, to speak for ourselves. And I want to see if there's a way to tie that with these sorts of projects, Overland and the Palestine Chronicle, and these efforts to kind of speak for ourselves against, the white imagination and whiteness and its right to write, as you say.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question. And thanks also to Ramzy and Evelyn. Yeah, that piece was actually published in Overland. So that, the piece you read from was called No Longer Malleable Stuff, which is a broader response to the, ongoing and very dangerous preoccupation of white settler culture to argue that it is their right to represent people, other people, and to even to construct to make a construct of others. Even as early as, it was pretty early in the 19th century, an English journalist called Frank Fowler. The title of that essay is called No Longer Malleable Stuff. An English journalist called Frank Fowler came to Australia and waxed lyrical about how, the rich pickings that Australia had for fictionists more broadly. He made a metaphor towards mining because Australia was about to begin its also long and very detrimental history of digging up the ground. But he described Aboriginal people, First Nations people, as malleable stuff in national discourse. Things that could be manipulated, moulded, shaped in any way that you want, and that the national white imagination might want. And that kind of taking became then conflated with and became part of the national discourse, and more broadly part of a Western discourse as well, that ties to Western theorists more broadly, which is fine if you come from a different cultural realm, perhaps around that organises itself differently. But things like Derrida's concepts or people of objectivity, or Barth's idea that the socio-economic and intersections and cultural background of the author is irrelevant to the story, which is quite ridiculous, because they actually rather drive the story. But yeah, I did write in that piece, the centre or whiteness, like the margins of otherness it defines, is a socio-cultural construct. And margins, unlike the ways we're cast in the white imagination, are locales of agency, resistance and change. And those within are totally exposed and externally immersed in the centre society that we surround. So let's just kind of reframing margins, because they do surround the centre and can encroach. And yeah, margins by nature circle the centre in their voices and actions, push inwards to challenge, to destabilise, to decentralise, and speak up, speak back, move into, displace, not to be like the centre or necessarily be the centre either, because they're getting into binary models, but really interrupting this language that is like the language of incarceration. And the pushback is like when the centre feels the margins pushing in. That's a true discourse. This invisible charter of rights in the centre's collective imagination becomes shouted the loudest. That's when you get charges of identity politics, of censorship, policing the white imagination. I'd encourage you to read the essay, because I don't want to take up a huge amount of time, but yeah, that is, and in Australia as an occupied country, First Nations people are only 3% of the broader population. But for that percentage, I think that that's such, numerically small representation, I suppose, of us, there is only, a really deep felt pushing from the centre, that backlash from the centre about that. But, I guess that's what's important. It's the push. And sorry, Ramzy mentioned something about language and polite language or civil. So there is in this country, there is the dangerous politics of civility that is weaponized against truth-telling. So like truth-telling becomes described as truth-telling by First Nations people, by people of culturally and linguistically diverse diasporas who are here now, becomes described as aggressive or divisive. And I'll just finish, because then I'd like to go and hear more from Michaela and Ramzy. Like, part of the politics of invasion, settler colonies everywhere, is the outward focus of the media and the discourse predominantly, but the outward focus away from occupied and invaded nations and to ironically, but other invasion discourses like Israel, and to make them look like liberation or freedom discourse. So like, just as a quick way to round up. So I was in the United States in 2017, just after the election of Trump, and for various reasons, but I had the pleasure of actually meeting a writer called Byron Appas, who's a Dene writer, and reading and talking about their nonfiction piece, which was really contemporary at the time. And it quotes an excerpt from Trump that I actually heard. And it says, but you could take this into a settler colony. It says the state of Israel is a symbol to the world of resilience in the face of oppression. I think no other state has gone through what they have gone through in survival of genocide. And at the same time, this speech was being made by the president and praising up somewhere outside of Turtle Island, Sacred Stone in Utah was forcibly evacuated. That's a site, an important site. And those who stayed were gassed with chemicals and shot with bullets and jailed and charged with trespass, etc. And I think Appas and the story that he wrote from that, which is called How Can You Ever Forget America, is poignant about the way different language is weaponized and different truth tellings are weaponized against different peoples. Thanks.
And I think as well, I just want to echo Jeanine's discussion around that essay in particular, which came out of a very specific context, which was quite interested in, we saw this fundamentally conservative, but disguised again under the guise of supposed progressivism and claims to imaginative freedom, where, we had an incredibly, what we felt as being an incredibly reasonable addition to a blind judging process for prizes, where we gave a voluntary question and said, if you're going to submit a piece for consideration for this prize that takes up the voice of a marginalized person or community, are you from that community or not? Apparently that caused an uproar, despite it being an entirely voluntary question that was devised around the specific circumstance where we'd seen people write submissions, literally just ventriloquizing communities that they had no connection with. So people sending in poems where they would use Aboriginal languages, and they were, old white men from the, some country town somewhere. And so that very specific circumstance we felt required a response. And that's something that I think I do want to emphasize, that, Overland's role is not simply to, we're not a stepping stone for syndication in The Guardian. We are our own, our own organization with a commitment to left-wing values of, of solidarity, of the sovereignty of dispossessed peoples, of justice, of humanity. These are not things that we consider particularly radical, but that are often positioned as radical. And this instance was another one of those circumstances where we'd attempted to create a structure that could be more accessible. And Jeanine was involved I asked her advice on, this wording. She was also involved in the establishment of a prize that was quite uniquely, we wanted to try and think about the idea of excellence and generosity in writing, and she was a big part of the establishment of that prize, the Karaka Prize, which was named in honour of her very good friend, Auntie Kerry Reid Gilbert, and the values that she demonstrated in the publishing community, which were of, generosity and of the growth and the nurturing of excellence. And so we brought all of these values into that thought process and thought, how can we help work with an issue of cultural ventriloquism, vulturism, really. And it is so shocking that you do have to continuously restate the obvious. Yes, do not take up the voice of people who have experienced things that you have no context for, or that you possibly are implicated in the ongoing consequences of, as was this case. So, Jeanine's response to that was sophisticated and generous and deeply, deeply informed by the long-standing patterns in Australian literature and culture and society that feeds into this. And again, we continue to receive this sort of blind rage, fury, criticism that we would dare to actually raise these questions or dare to try to think with dignity and with generosity and with sensitivity to those sorts of issues. So we find it's a constantly bizarre learning experience working for an organisation like Overland, which is sadly more unique in this landscape than we want it to be, more unique in the context of Australian publishing than we want it to be. But it's important. It is important in a different way that the Palestine Chronicle is important and is, deeply pertinent for the amplification of the resistance of the streets, which is something that we cannot directly access in Australia because of the extent of censorship and because of the extent of Australian implication in the broader Zionist projects. And our access to it does have to come through a multitude of channels, including, as you say, the Palestine Chronicle is there so that you do not have to dilute Palestinian voices under the, the neoliberal structures and filters of the West, because there will always be a dilution. But there are still the lived consequences of being Palestinian in diaspora in a settler colony such as Australia, that I think it is important that Overland continues to play a role in responsibility and accountability in. It's not that we seek to replace other spaces that can more directly advocate and more directly speak to the ongoing violence and the necessity of resistance and the necessity of that being, that being armed resistance, that being a military resistance, those sorts of things that you could not publish in The Guardian. But we're able to speak on issues that happen to Palestinians on the ground here in Australia. What we've just seen with the Adelaide Writers' Week, that affected Palestinian writers in Australia, but that's also now going to, Louise Adler's advocacy, and that was amazing. She stood up for it and said, no, I don't care. You can pull out your funding. I don't care. This is something I value and this is something I care about, and good for her. But we would be naive if we didn't think that other festival organisers are going to look at what happened and they're going to hesitate, or they're going to be, I don't even know if I've ever seen a panel of 4 Palestinian writers at a writers' festival, and I think it was wonderful to have it. But the consequences of that deeply conservative, deeply, that deep epistemic violence that this colony is built on, and is perfectly willing to extend not just to Aboriginal people, but anyone who comes from any form of colonised experience. We need to be very closely monitoring that because it's insidious. The publishing landscape is rife with these same drives that Schwartz Media is built on. And it's important that our outlets, as much as possible, do stay accountable to that, because if you're not actually involved in a direct critique, you are involved in the silencing that furthers these these strategies. And that does have a lived consequence on the lives of Palestinians living in exile in Australia who have the right to speak to their lives and to their experiences. And so we're able to do that, it's not about making people human, and if people read Overland because they want to see the other as more human, then I'd ask that they cancel their subscription or give it to somebody else, because you've come to us with the wrong. Yeah, you're really not at the starting line there. But I just want to call attention to particularly to an ongoing topic about the lived experience of Palestinians in Australia at the moment that we've published quite a lot on. Nick Riemer has been publishing quite a lot regarding this. The IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism and the consequences of that explicit terminology, which basically implies that any critique of Israel is now anti-Semitism, and that universities cannot allow any critique, whether it be political or military or social, any form of critique of Israel would be disallowed if all universities continue to adopt this definition of anti-Semitism. And so far, I can't remember how many universities have so far taken up this language, and that's really disconcerting. But I would like to just highlight that there's a lot of agency and there's a lot of power and momentum in the student unions in these institutions, such as the University of Melbourne, which has adopted this language of the definition of anti-Semitism, but it's the students and it's the student unions who are there who are saying, no, we do not accept this, and who are passing motions in solidarity with Palestine. And amplifying that work and that project does, I hope, continue to place pressure on the universities to at the very least realise that they are not wholly constitutive and representative of every single student or staff or person that works in them. There are people there working at the University of Melbourne who do stand in solidarity for Palestine. And, I just celebrate their continued union and activist work. And I think it's great and needs to keep happening more of it.
Sorry, it's just, there's a very important point I would like to raise. What is it?
Oh, I was going to say, Auntie Jeanine has her hand up, but you can go.
Yeah, I just want to say something really quickly before we switch to, thanks very much. Then I think hand over to Ramzy. But it just follows up from something that Evelyn was saying, and also just, further evidence of the prevalence of this kind of dangerous but nice speak discourse. In the lead up to the Adelaide Writers' Week, an article was published in the Friday Conversation by a white Australian author, which was, I'd encourage you to read it. I mean, it's really quite distressing for me, and as it will be for a lot of other people, but it's called Free Speech or Genocide Cheering. Ukrainian authors withdraw from Adelaide Writers' Week, published on 24 February in Conversation Friday essay, where a white settler author actually describes one of the testimonials, one of the encouragements written by one of those authors as a masterpiece in tone. And I think that I found it really quite offensive. I wrote to the person who wrote it, who got offended by the fact that I was offended, who said that my comment about, checking the language and a critical discourse analysis on this piece does make it, is really, really revealing. But I think possibly the most telling thing was that settler author who was really they said they weren't, but their words said the other thing. They said they're not encouraging people to actually boycott Adelaide, but they are encouraging people to think about whether they go to Adelaide because of what's been said by Palestinian writers. Now, particularly focusing on one of these writers, who's actually a Melbourne-based Ukrainian writer. But I just want to say that in terms of calling this a masterpiece in tone, well, that holds the key to reading that piece and other pieces that appear in the mainstream press that shut down conversation and truth-telling. And like she's asked that question, you know, and posed it like, well, this is not really shutting down free speech. This is about not promoting a genocide discourse. But it says, you know, what I said, for those in any doubt, the term tone is that refers to both sight and sound and atmosphere, and the sight or lack of, and the sound and the way the invasion and the genocide is written, and the colour of those who are massacred and dispossessed, and the colour of those who are writing the history in its aftermath, are quite pivotal in understanding the white supremacy that this article and the pro-invasion discourse that this article spouts here, in advocating really proudly that this is actually a masterpiece in tone for attempting to encourage people not to attend. But you can sort of reverse that reading and take that tone, because it really plays very, very deeply into the skin politics, skin tone politics of Australia and invasion discourse, and what you can and can't write. And I haven't responded to that piece yet, because I think that will be difficult to publish anywhere. Thanks.
Right. So I think it's important that we understand why the whole anti-Semitism debate is actually happening in the first place. Instead of just constantly trying to de-alienate the Zionists, use that as a way to shut down the conversation, and that we are not anti-Semitic and we have Jewish friends and we promise we're not really anti-Semitic, and we are going to find those bad anti-Semites amongst us and we're going to kick them out of our groups. And I mean, this story is repeated all over the world. It's been repeated for decades. So if you guys think that you are going to resolve it in Australia, good luck with that. It's just not going to happen. The fact is, this is just a tactic, and it aims at creating distractions from the subject. And the distraction is two kinds of distractions. Number one, distraction from what is happening in Palestine. I have been here for over a week now, and I haven't seen anybody talk about what happened in Nablus, what happened in Shafat, what happened in Jeanine, what happened in Jericho, what happened in the refugee camps in northern West Bank. Nobody. I mean, just think, ponder at this. Just consider this. This is our failure. We have terribly failed. Let's stop congratulating ourselves. And we went and we were a panel and we spoke. The media destroyed us. And yes, we won the audience that came to listen, but we were tortured in the media. And there was no army of alternative media to balance out the picture. Not a single person approached us in Australia asking for an interview in Adelaide. Not one. This is a disaster. So we spend so much time preparing. Susan Abulhawa, what are you going to say? They are going to tell you this and you are going to prove. We played into their hands and they won. They have won this battle. And that's a problem. So I think we need to kind of go back and think about what just happened. Not just that, you know, Smotrich was actually in Australia. I just discovered that by chance in Brisbane. The guy who said, I am a fascist homophobe, the Minister of Finance, was actually in Australia. They tried to block my visa, but they didn't block the visa of someone who is calling for the complete destruction of Hawara. We didn't even talk about it. I found out by chance that he was, right? And the other distraction is the distraction from what the Australian government does to support and sustain that settler colonial project. So you have one settler colonial state supporting and funding another settler colonial state, and the victims of both of these states cannot even get the chance to even say, hello, my name is Ramzy Baroud. I mean, this is ridiculous. So we have to go back to the drawing board. This was not a victory for us, you guys. Let's just admit that. If you think this that we will ever be able to reverse the trend by trying to prove that free speech is not anti-Semitism and that sort of thing, then you are fighting the wrong battle. Jeremy Corbyn tried that. The Labour Party in the UK, they tried that. And I remember I was in the UK at the time, and I met with members of the Labour Party, and I said, you guys, if just expand your horizon and look at the experiences of others. Have you ever seen once in the history of this conflict that the Zionists have ever came and certified anybody of not being anti-Semitic? Never happened once. So by keep issuing one statement after another, after a third, what you have achieved is that you have participated in the distraction campaign that they have created. So Jeremy Corbyn spent all of these years trying to prove that the Labour Party is not anti-Semitic and the bad apples have been already removed and everything is gonna okay, but they come back the next morning and some newspaper would have found some tweeted by some guy, and we go through the same process until Jeremy Corbyn was out. Actually, he was far more effectual as a community organizer, as an MP, because he hosted lots of events on Palestine, fundraisers for Palestine, conferences for Palestine. During that time, he retreated completely. And he spent all of this time trying to prove that he is not anti-Semitic. This is not going to work for you. It didn't work in the UK. The country that came up with the Balfour Declaration is not going to work for you. So you have to go back and study the mistakes. The mistakes. I feel like in some extent we played into their hands, by the way. Let's study all these mistakes and go back without judging them. That's what they do, and they do it good. So this whole idea, you Zionists, that's what they do. They limit freedom of speech. Well, that's what they do, and they are good at it. Now it's your responsibility to find a way to respond and win eventually. And that's what I think it's enough that we do not congratulate ourselves too much and just study where things went wrong. And hopefully by the next Adelaide Festival, we have learned from some of these mistakes.
So I wanted to thank our panelists and move to some questions from the audience before we close this event. I wanted to also comment on these tensions that you've all raised in the way that I think, like, if we do want to reflect and learn, it's for us to kind of become smarter about white supremacy in this settler colonial context and its impact on our work within the Palestine movement, right? Because this is all white supremacy, what you witnessed with the shutdown that you experienced with the Adelaide Writers Festival, and the way that, you know, there's very little space for response. It's because that is how white power works in this context. And that is how, you know, international issues, whether it's Palestine or West Papua or other causes that, you know, the Australian state doesn't want any antagonism over, that's how they get shut down. And of course, this is an extension of how First Nations struggle here is also continuously, you know, censored, surveilled, criminalized. So I'll take questions both from people here and on Zoom, and then I'll give it to the panel to respond. So maybe I'll take a few questions and then give them a chance to. Yeah, Noura? Maybe we'll go Noura, Michaela, and then we can go to Zoom. Yeah.
Shukran. Thank you, Ramzy, and the rest of the speakers. And thank you, everyone organizing, making sure this event happened. So two things. I have maybe just an extension, a comment on what recently just Ramzy concluded with, and then I have a question that is general to writing. So I think Zionists will chase us in every corner of the world. Whether we're in Palestine and then, you know, 1948 in Akka and Jeanine and Ghazi, in the diaspora, everything that we do will be attacked and we will be targeted regardless to what is it that we're doing, what language it is that we're speaking. The fact that we're speaking, we exist is a problem. It's an issue for them. And I think the onus is on us as Palestinians and as advocates and as allies to constantly keep reshaping and refocusing and reshifting the focus and reprioritizing what really matters. So yes, there'll be heaps of arguments and heaps of accusations, but I feel like it's our responsibility not to be defensive, not to be reactive, but also keep thinking about what is the key issue at hand. And the key issue at hand is that we have a settler colonial project that has been going on for over a century. So I think this is something that we need to do better, and I agree with you. My question is a general question about writing, but it's also specific to the community of Palestinian writers as well. Like, how does writing contribute to building a community amongst writers, but also beyond writers?
Thank you, Jeanine and Evelyn and Ramzy, for your comments and interventions. As someone who is in Adelaide, I'm going to disagree with you, Ramzy. I don't think it was a failure. I think as part of the Palestinian community and context here, we're building solidarities with the people who matter. We had Jeanine Leane on stage, we had Lorna Munro on stage, we had Karen Wilde on stage, and we had Amy McQuire on stage. Incredible First Nations writers in this country showing us, the Palestinian community in this country, solidarity. And that is a movement we're building. And I don't think it's right to dismiss that and say that we lost. I think that in itself is a huge victory.
Michaela, in terms of impact,
yeah,
not in terms of solidarity. That's a different thing.
But it is a project that we've worked hard on in this
and I don't mean to dismiss that, but it's a friendly setting, and I think we have to be quite honest with ourselves. Otherwise, we can't possibly grow if we are not.
And look, I agree with Noura, and I agree with you about reflecting on what we can do better. But I do want to acknowledge that. I think we can't always sit in the misery of our situation. I think acknowledging what was great about that is worth saying. And I want to say that to people here as someone who also participated in that. And there are a lot of difficult things about it and a lot of things that didn't go well, particularly in terms of media response. And that is a broader conversation, and Evelyn in particular addressed that this evening. The other, and this was the sort of question I had. So Jeanine, you wrote a wonderful review recently in the Sydney Review of Books, and I've not got the name of it with me, but Jeanine is thinking about how First Nations writers have been received in the white stream, and in particular the reception of Udru Nunakal's work as being politica, right? And in a more contemporary setting, a white critic is now comparing a contemporary writer to Udru as being more literary than angry writers like Evelyn and like Jeanine and like other writers. And I think Mohammed Al-Kurd also was being criticised around the Adelaide Writers' Festival for his angry writing and for his political writing. And so I wonder if people on the panel, it's quite an open question, would like to comment on the literary virtue and the literary merit of political writing and what we might currently describe as angry writing, but I think is a very legitimate and potentially really powerful and beautiful form of literary production and contribution. Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind jumping in there to start with. Look, yeah, I really did think, I thought that there was a tremendous amount of solidarity and strength to be gained there at the festival and Adelaide Writers Week. And I guess as someone who, it's a slow grind, and I think it's the small spaces that we look forward to work. It's like I said about the margins. And I also think as someone who grew up here, I mean, and Evelyn has alluded to this as well, about the, Evelyn alluded to the fact that things are often shut down and that, the censorship. And like even 10 years ago, but especially 20 years ago, what happened in Adelaide between First Nations people and Palestinian writers, and that opportunity to at least get on stage and speak the truth, it was pretty monumental. And, you know, you can say that starts at a pretty low bar. And I agree with that. It should have happened a long time ago. But yeah, I think the space for discourse across solidarity, you know, like strength discourse, solidarity discourse, not deficit discourse, and not discourse that is entrapped. Now getting to Michaela's question, thanks, Michaela. Not discourse that is entrapped by the kind of settler civilities that I spoke about before, that are weaponized always against people, about being divisive, about being aggressive, or worse, you know, about being terrorists, about being, yeah, like, what's the other word? Like hecklers, you know, like, I know that those spaces have to be interrupted, and it, you know, it is small steps, and the fact that that happened was quite incredible, and several Australians said that, particularly some of the First Nations Australians. But yeah, and on that writing and political writing and angry writing, yeah, I've said a lot of times that there is really important spaces for anger. I love the way Muhammad Al-Kurd spoke about it on the panel when someone did ask about the writing and the anger and said, what do you owe people? He said, I don't think I owe people anything other than the truth. And, you know, I think that to use that anger very, very powerfully, as it is there very powerfully, but also in a way that is quite measured and doesn't no longer, this has been a hard lesson for me, but no longer try and minimise actually the impact of the labels of the rude or radical or aggressive or all of the above Black person. And there is such a thing as radical conformism, which I have also written about in another piece. Sometimes you have to appear to conform, you have to appear to be in compliance to get the space in the first place. And then when you get it, do something different with it. It's like the master's tools won't disable the master's own house. And why do you want to live there anyway with such oppression? But you can take those tools and build your own. Use those tools or use them differently. So that's on, yeah, on politics and writing. And I don't think it's really inseparable either. The two, for me, on writing or politics or on the personal or the political is, for me, as a First Nations writer here, is inseparable or inseparable. Yeah, but thanks, Michaela. I think maybe Evelyn or someone else might want to say something about that, or another question.
I'm not sure about the term angry writing. Maybe this is more applicable here. I mean, every academic space has its own language. And like, for example, I was introduced to the term, I'm a Palestinian and I'm a settler yesterday in Brisbane, and I couldn't, like I was a bit bewildered for a little bit because we have, you know, a completely different definition of what a settler is. And I argue that, no, we are not settlers, because a settler is someone who takes agency in making the decisions that he makes. A group of Palestinians on a boat, or Syrians or Lebanese or Afghanis, you know, floating across some sea somewhere to reach a safe destination are not really settlers. And I believe that if the people of this land, the First Nations, were still in control of this territory, I think they would have welcomed these refugees. And I don't think they would have called them settlers. But I understand that, again, every political space has its own language that we tend to adhere to. There's a story actually I'd like to share. There's a group of Native Americans in the Northwest. No, actually, rather not in the Northwest, in the central parts of the United States. You might have already heard about this 170 years ago when the potato famine happened in Ireland. That was 10 years after the infamous Trail of Tears. They were starving and they were dying. Yet they collected $170 and they sent it to Ireland to help the people of that land. When COVID struck Native American communities expectedly much harder than others, the people of Ireland started this fundraiser on GoFundMe, and they raised millions of dollars. And the message that was throughout social media by Irish people was, our debt has been repaid 170 years later. And I was reflecting on all of these things, you know, intersectionality and solidarity and all these principles. And the Native Americans have figured this out 200 years ago, and we are still trying to put it in a relatable language, you know, translated from academic to language that ordinary people can understand. So I would like to believe that if Palestinians found themselves in America back then, I think the Native Americans, I don't think they would have called us settlers. But again, so angry writing. I was born and raised in Gaza, and yes, I was angry for obvious reasons. But when I went to America, I was a little bit more cautious about, you know, the whole angry Arab thing going on there. The angry black man, the angry Arab. And they don't mean like, well, they are angry because they have every reason to be angry. That's not the social context. They are angry because they are just irrational. I mean, it's Orientalism through and through. So I would, and maybe part of us try to appear not so angry, as in we dissect and deconstruct and analyze and explain and humanize and do all of these things so that people don't see us as that angry Palestinian or angry black man or woman. So I feel like I have to be a little bit cautious about that context. It might work in Australia, but it certainly wouldn't work in America, considering the stereotype affiliated with certain groups of people.
I think in terms of the conversation around settler and that language, that's something that's significantly more complex than what can be attended to in this session. So I would probably flag that who the person that you met in introducing themselves to you in that way, I doubt they would have come to that language neutrally, and I doubt that they would have come to that language passively. And I suspect that their use of that terminology actually suggests those very networks of solidarity and understanding that you're speaking of in regards to the relationships between First Nations peoples from Ireland and Turtle Island, who obviously both share contexts of colonization, and that understanding and that solidarity doesn't come to people neutrally by virtue of proximity. It comes from a shared experience, and we can do the very best that we can to access whatever languages we're speaking to each other in, but they're not our languages. It's not the language of this land. It's not the language of your land either, but it's a language that has come to be used and understood specifically to speak to different political positionalities that relate to people being moved from the place where they came from. And in the case of the shared context of the person you spoke to and the people that she must have spoken to have come to an understanding of that language, it is a shared context of violent dispossession. And I think actually that language might appear to suggest a kind of internalization of the same logics that the Zionist boycott would love to use to, again, as you say, further distract from the issue. But I suggest that it's perhaps a signifier that there are many more conversations that have happened beyond the surface of that encounter. Do I encourage people to use that terminology? Not necessarily. I don't know. People refer to themselves the way that they refer to themselves. But when you get past that initial point of introduction, you don't need that language anyway. So that's what I'd probably say in regards to that. I have something only really very small to highlight in terms of the conversation around writing and the role of writing for Palestinians, because I'm not Palestinian, but Fahad Ali wrote a really beautiful response to Adelaide Writers Week for the Institute of Palestine Studies, where he talked about Muhammad al-Kurd's poetry and kind of, the whole language and hostility around that. And I think, however short the kind of reading of the poetry was, I do think that it was a beautiful response, and I would really encourage people to have a look at that. And then I guess all I kind of really want to affirm and reiterate is that, from my understanding as an Aboriginal woman who has grown up in country that is not my country ancestrally, but that is the country that my family were moved to and that we have had to learn to survive on in solidarity with other Aboriginal people who were moved all around our state. Growing up still with our culture and still with our identity and sometimes with our language, which is remarkable. Those connections and solidarities are always multi-layered. And if the experience of Palestinians living in exile, living in diaspora here in Australia in this settler colony is anything like what we had to go through, you have to find ways of making life livable. And writing and speaking to the truth and the violence of history is making things visible in a way that might not intervene in the continuation of that violence, but certainly acknowledges the ongoing impact that it has. Yeah. And, I learn endlessly from the Palestinian writers in Australia, whether I go into a bookshop and buy it, or if I go to a poetry reading and listen to it, or whether I get the intense honor of being able to work with those writers in the capacity that I have at Overland. More and more, it's these connections of activism and solidarity. And it is, when I was a baby student activist, there were always Palestinians at the very front of the rally. And that is the kind of honoring and those relationships that I think go so much further than the language and the representations and the images and the articles and the poems. And they're artifacts, but those deeper connections, experiences, they're there and they continue to be there. And I think of those and I just think about what I can do in my own way of making somebody else's experience a tiny bit more livable. And that's not to celebrate or congratulate or pat anyone on the back for that. It is to think about how you live in responsibility to ongoing violence.
I'm wary of the time. I don't know if you want to take more questions or.
Tasnim, there's a question from Zoom.
Okay. How many?
And also a very quick comment from me, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I think maybe we'll just take one more question and then we can have a discussion with our speakers who are here with us in person, because we'll all go have some drinks and refreshments and network and connect after we close. But yeah, we can. Yeah.
Well, perhaps we can take the comment and then go and then the question.
Yeah, so my comment to Ramzy first is, Ramzy, the stereotype of the angry Arab and the angry Black woman and the angry Black man is also here. You only have to read about awesome Lydia Thorpe and what she has been going through and all the nonsense around what she's going through. But I think the argument more here is for us to claim that and actually, be comfortable in being the angry Arab woman or the angry Black man, or but that's also a process that we have to go through, I guess. The question from the audience is from Susie Munzer. And Susie asks, For new journalists starting out in spaces where these conversations are completely eradicated or discarded, is it worth attempting to amplify these stories through the mainstream, or is it better to shift our energies to raise and normalize alternative publications? Yeah, I agree with you, Jeanine.
Yeah, I just want to say that, I'm personally, after 25 plus years of experience in journalism, I think the answer is definitely alternative media outlets. But when I say alternative, I do not talk about a single alternative media outlet. I'm talking about many, because our power can only come with our ability to connect and coordinate at a large number. A single newspaper, alternative newspaper, cannot offset the disastrous writings and embarrassing journalism of the Australian, for example. But maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 such outlets could. So that's, I think, what should be the focus. I asked a friend in Adelaide, where do Australian Palestine community get their news from? She said, well, the Electronic Intifada, the Palestine Chronicle, and others. And I said, any outlets in Australia itself? And she said, no. And I don't think that's acceptable. I think that should be the focus. I would love for everybody to read the Palestine Chronicle, but I don't think that we can possibly fit into the spaces in which you operate here in Australia. So you have to have a dedicated Palestine news outlet that is dedicated to covering daily news from Palestine, but is shaped and written and molded for an Australian audience. So that's really the way out of this mess. And this way, we're not going to be captive to the good heart and kindness of some mainstream journalists, regardless of where they are.
I agree with all of that. I'd probably also add, though, I actually think there is some benefit in sending pieces to publications that will never publish them and then demand an explanation for why they won't publish them. I think that that's probably the best way to learn from, to encourage, it's not your emotional labor. It's not your responsibility to do that. But if at the very least we can draw attention to the fact that this complacency narrative we have, progressive except for Palestine, yada, yada, all of the different rhetorics and structures of that are predicated on individuals upholding that and, forcing them to concede, no, actually, I can't speak on this. I can't let you speak on this, might encourage them to be more reflective of their own actions and behavior in the broader publishing industry. So as long as you can handle the emotional turmoil of getting a piece rejected, I think that there is a kind of strategic virtue in sending things and then saying, why will you not? Is this your decision? Is this your publication's decision?
And also, I think it's a question of just, in the chat came up, so many people think the conversation or the Guardian or the Independent or the Guardian are independent. They're not. Like, I think the general public doesn't know who owns what media. Or, not as much as they should anyway. I mean, I teach creative writing at the University of Melbourne normally, and I'd say at the start, half the people in my class, because I always ask this, don't know, other than what the media outlets are called, this is the Guardian, this is the Comms, they don't know who owns them. So, I mean, I think, and it is a deliberate ploy, as Angie and someone else has said in the chat, to lead people to believe that these publications and other media outlets are at the very least neutral. So, but yeah, I think that's the last thing I want to say. So other than, thank you so much for coming and for the panel.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to thank our panelists as well. And I've been trying to stick to my role as a chair, so I've limited my commentary and responses. I have, but I feel like, this is a beginning of a discussion and a continuation of a discussion as well, because in our movement spaces and through, Black Palestinian solidarity, we have been unpacking a lot of the themes that we've crossed over today. And yeah, like I would say just one thing about progressive except for Palestine, like for some of us actually, we've been trying to complicate that because we don't see it as except for Palestine. We actually see it as, you know, this progressivism is exactly, you know, white settler colonialism and white supremacy as well. So there's a lot to think about and a lot to say. And I'm really grateful that we had such an enriching, interesting conversation, one that we'll have like here in this space and for a long time. And an event like this also made possible with you being here for Adelaide Writers Festival. So that's, you know, one outcome that we can say for us on the margins is a win, I would think. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Good evening. Have a nice night. Have a good discussion.
I'll hand over to Carlos because I think we have a surprise performance happening.
Thanks, Tasnim. Thanks everybody. I believe Asil is here and she's coming up. Asil is a good friend of the Institute, a Palestinian activist and a performer, and she'd like to sort of share the moment with us. And please come up, Asil. Thank you.
First, thank you very much for this beautiful conversation. I live a bit far from the city, so I'm not as lucky to kind of have amazing people around that really care about Palestine. It's a shame that it's a drive to come. I'm sure Nora is as well, and many people come here from far to kind of listen to this. So I really hope this keep going, even if Ramzy is with us today and might not be, but I'd like to keep having these conversations more. A Palestinian dear friend of mine that most of you know, but I will not mention her name, said, don't sing these songs because you will be in troubles. But now that I feel that it is a safe place for me to sing, I'm going to sing a Palestinian kind of theme song that is sang by my favorite singer, Kulthum. It's a at least 70-something years old song. And it's kind of just reminding us to kind of keep fighting. I hope you know it, Ramzy, because I'm singing it for you today. أصبح عندي الآن بندقية إلى فلسطين خذوني معكم إلى ربا حزينة كوجه المجدلية إلى القباب الخضر والحجارات النبي أصبح عندي الآن بندقية إلى فلسطين خذوني معكم إلى ربا حزينة كوجه المجدلية إلى القباب الخضر والحجارات النبي 70 عاما وأنا أبحث عن أرض وعن هوية 70 عاما وأنا أبحث عن أرض وعن هوية أبحث عن وطن الذي هناك عن وطن المحاط بالأسلاك أبحث عن طفولتي وعن رفاق حارتي أبحث عن طفولتي وعن رفاق حارتي عن كتبي عن صوري عن كل ركن دافئ وكل مزهرية إلى فلسطين خذوني معكم يا أيها الرجال أريد أن أعيش أو أموت كالرجال أصبح عندي الآن بندقية. Thank you. And for Thank you. For those who don't speak Arabic, this song says, now I have a rifle and take me back to Palestine, to those places I miss. It talks about to those places that I used to play with, those childhood friendships, those corners, to these holy spaces, and إلى القباب الخضري, is like to those green domes and al-hijaratul abi, and those kind of holy stones that we hold when we fight and when we yeah, just tell our stories. It's a song that is Kulthum sang, I think, almost 80 years ago. She said 20 عاما. When I sang it, I said 70 عاما, because like she sang it when it was 20 years and now it's 70 years. And I hope that my daughter would not sing it and say my mom used to sing it 50 years ago. But it's our reality, and until inshallah we sing together in Palestine when it's free, we will keep singing. I met Carlos because I sing this kind of revolutionary songs. Normally people say غني دمي فلسطيني, like I don't really sing those songs. I love them, but I sing the songs that, you know, people used to sing to kind of keep the fight going, and not those which I love and respect, those that make resistance only beautiful. Like resistance can be beautiful, but it's also so painful, and we should kind of balance between to kind of keep the stories, the real ones, happening, and not just sugarcoat them. It's like, oh, it's good, like let's just put a kufiya and dance and it's fine. It's not. And until the freedom that we have in here to carry the flag is the same in Palestine, we have to keep telling those stories. Thank you for inviting me, Carlos.
Thanks, Asil. Thank you, everybody. So we welcome you to have a cup of tea, have some mineral water, have some juice, to talk with each other, to talk to some of the panelists that are here with us for a little bit longer. And thank you again.
Don't have too much fun without us.